6:15 in the morning, February 26, 1945. A ridge of broken volcanic rock on the northern half of a 5.5-mile island called Iwo Jima. Private Wilson Watson, a 22-year-old former sharecropper from Tuscumbia, Alabama, lay behind a Browning automatic rifle with his platoon pinned flat against the ash. Ahead of them, a Japanese pillbox had gone silent in exactly the way that meant it was still loaded. Watson got up anyway. He crossed open ground half running, half crawling, firing from the hip into the embrasure until he was close enough to put a grenade through the slot, and then he ran around behind the position and killed the men trying to flee out the back. His platoon moved forward over the ground he had just cleared. That was the first of 2 days. What happened on the second day is the reason this story exists, and it will not be told yet. For now, understand only this. Watson was carrying a weapon that the Japanese Army, in 8 years of nearly unbroken victory across Asia and the Pacific, had never found an answer for. Not a rifle that fired faster. An entirely different arithmetic of a firefight. One automatic weapon built into every 12-man squad, spitting sustained fire that a rifleman with a 5-round bolt action simply could not produce. What that weapon actually did to a Japanese infantry assault, in physical mechanical terms, will be explained in full once the ground has been set. And within roughly 2 years of the war's end, the tactic that Imperial Japan had built its entire infantry doctrine around, the coordinated night charge, the willingness to close the distance and die doing it, would be a piece of military history rather than a live threat, buried under a weight of fire that a single American rifle squad could now generate on its own. How that happened, and what it cost Watson personally to be standing at the center of it, is the story. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what the Imperial Japanese Army actually was in December of 1941, because the popular image of a doomed, resource-starved force flattens a genuinely frightening military machine. Japanese infantry divisions that swept through Malaya covered 20 miles a day on bicycles and captured Singapore, a fortress the British had spent 2 decades building, in 70 days. On Bataan and Corregidor, they broke an American and Filipino army twice their number. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and Burma, they demonstrated a level of physical endurance, night discipline, and small unit initiative that Allied commanders openly respected, and in the first year of the war feared. Japanese soldiers trained from childhood in a code that made surrender unthinkable and death in the Emperor's service. A kind of fulfillment moved through terrain Western armies considered impassable, and they did it while living on rations that would have broken most Western units in a week. Their signature weapon was not a rifle at all. It was the night attack, massed infantry, bayonets fixed, closing distance in darkness or at dawn, screaming, absorbing the first ragged volleys of defensive fire and simply continuing forward until they reached the trench line, where discipline, cold steel, and sheer nerve decided it. Marines who survived their first one did not forget it. The psychological weight of it mattered as much as the tactical one. It convinced men on the receiving end that they were fighting something that did not stop. There is a popular version of this reputation that overstates itself, and it is worth correcting here rather than later. The idea that every Japanese soldier in the Pacific was a fanatic incapable of tactical thought does not survive contact with the actual record. Japanese small unit commanders in Malaya and the Philippines showed real tactical sophistication. Infiltration by squads through terrain the defenders considered secure, coordinated attacks timed to the minute, deliberate targeting of officers and radio operators to break up a defense before the main assault arrived. The night charge was not blind fanaticism. It was a deliberate doctrine, refined over years of fighting in China, chosen because it worked, because Western-trained armies of the period generally did not have the sustained close-range firepower at the squad level to stop it. That is the detail that gets lost in the retelling, and it is the detail that makes the rest of this story make sense. The tactic that terrified so many Allied soldiers in 1942 was not desperation. It was a rational choice by a professional army, made under an assumption about enemy firepower that had not yet been tested against what was coming. American and Filipino troops on Bataan learned the cost of fighting that army with the wrong tools. Standard infantry doctrine going into the war put a bolt-action rifle in almost every man's hands 5 rounds, then a manual reload, then 5 more. Against an enemy who came in waves and pressed the attack at close range in darkness, that rate of fire left gaps. Gaps got filled with bayonets and too often with American and Filipino dead. Machine guns existed, but they were heavy, crew-served, tied to fixed positions, and slow to reposition when a night attack came from an unexpected direction. There were partial answers tried in the first 2 years. Thin the line and rely on artillery pre-registered on likely approaches. Stack automatic weapons at choke points and hope the enemy obliged by attacking there. Issue more grenades and trust nerve alone to hold a line in the dark. Each of these worked sometimes and failed badly other times, because none of them solved the actual problem, which was that a rifle squad on defense needed to generate far more sustained fire, far faster, without needing a crew or a fixed emplacement, and without giving up the mobility to go on the attack itself. Guadalcanal, fought from August 1942 through February 1943, was where this shortfall was paid for in full 6 months of jungle fighting, where American Marines and soldiers absorbed repeated night assaults with a mix of makeshift solutions, improvised fire discipline, and raw endurance, buying time for a real answer to arrive. Men who fought there in the earliest weeks described the same recurring problem in their letters and after-action statements. A defensive line held by riflemen, however brave, developed thin spots the instant a sustained attack forced a fast reload, and a thin spot at 2 in the morning in dense jungle was where the fighting was decided. The Marines on the Tenaru River and later at Edson's Ridge held largely because heavy machine guns happened to be sighted correctly, and because artillery could be called in close enough to break up the attacking waves, not because the rifle squad itself had an adequate answer. That distinction mattered enormously to the men making the argument for change, because it meant survival still depended on circumstances lining up correctly rather than on something every squad could rely on by design. The answer had, in fact, already existed for 24 years. It had simply never been organized around the problem correctly. The moment that changed came slowly rather than in a single dramatic reveal, pattern recognition, built engagement by engagement, as American squad leaders began treating one weapon not as a heavy rifle, but as the organizing center of an entire small unit's tactics. Once that mental shift happened, the weakness in the Japanese approach became visible in one hard, clean sentence. A night charge that had to cross open ground in the face of one automatic weapon per squad was no longer walking into gaps. It was walking into a wall. That weapon had been born in a different war entirely, for a different purpose, and the story of how it got to a ridge on Iwo Jima in 1945 starts with a single American gun designer, and a tactical problem the trenches of 1917 had made brutally obvious. John Moses Browning, already the most prolific firearms designer in American history by the time the United States entered the First World War, was approached by the Army with a specific, narrow requirement. Infantry attacking across no man's land needed a rifle that a single soldier could carry and fire while advancing on foot, spraying suppressive fire from the hip or the shoulder to keep German defenders' heads down during the assault. The doctrine that generated this request had a name, walking fire, and it demanded something that did not yet exist in American hands, a genuinely portable automatic weapon, not a tripod-mounted machine gun that took a crew to move. Browning delivered it in a matter of months. The Browning automatic rifle, officially adopted in 1917 and rushed into production for 1918, weighed roughly 16 pounds unloaded, fired the same powerful .30 caliber cartridge as the standard infantry rifle, and fed from a 20-round box magazine that a single rifleman could swap out in a few seconds. It arrived at the front too late to shape the outcome of the First World War in any major way. By the time enough of them reached French soil, the fighting that would have proven the concept was already ending. But the weapon itself did not go away. It sat in American arsenals for 2 decades, was modified in the 1930s with a bipod and a hinged buttplate for prone firing as the M1918A2, and waited for a war that would actually need what it did. The handful of bars that did reach French soil in the war's final weeks saw only limited action before the armistice, and the walking fire tactic it had been built for was never truly tested at scale in the war that produced it. That is one of the stranger facts buried in this weapon's history. It was designed to solve a problem in one war and ended up solving an almost entirely different problem, for a different army, a quarter century later, on islands whose names did not yet exist on any American map in 1918. What it did, once it reached the Pacific, turned out to matter far more in defense than in the offense it had been designed for. A single bar gunner could put out sustained automatic fire that no rifleman could match, and could do it lying flat in a foxhole, moving with a squad through jungle, or standing at the crest of a hill firing from the hip. Watson would prove all three inside of 48 hours. It had genuine weight to it, real recoil, and a barrel that heated fast under sustained fire, none of which the men who carried it in 90-degree jungle heat would call an advantage. But it had one property almost nobody expected going in: reliability under filth. Dropped in mud, packed with volcanic ash, soaked in the humidity of a New Guinea rainforest, it kept firing when far more delicate automatic weapons on both sides jammed. Marines in the Pacific, almost universally, stripped off the bipod, and the flash hider Browning's later modification had added, because in jungle and island fighting the extra weight bought nothing, and the speed of getting the weapon into action from the hip bought everything. What the men who carried it came to believe about it was simple and unsentimental. It was heavy, it was punishing to hump for miles, and when the shooting started, everyone within 100 yards wanted to be standing near the man carrying it, not the man across from him. The tactical idea built around that weapon is where the real transformation happened, and it is worth explaining in plain terms because it is not complicated. It is just something almost nobody had organized correctly before. Each American infantry squad, by the time the Pacific campaigns reached their later stages, was built around a single automatic rifleman as its core. The rest of the squad's job was not simply to advance and shoot individually. It was to protect that one man, keep him supplied with loaded magazines, and let his weapon be the base of fire that everyone else's movement depended on. In an attack, riflemen would move forward in short rushes while the bar gunner kept the enemy position suppressed. In defense, the entire squad's foxholes were dug and oriented around giving that one weapon the clearest possible field of fire. It sounds almost too simple to be a doctrine. The discipline it demanded was the hard part. A bar gunner firing in long, undisciplined bursts would burn through a 20-round magazine in under 3 seconds and overheat a barrel that then had to be swapped under fire. The doctrine that made the weapon effective was short, controlled bursts, 5 or 6 rounds at a time, fire discipline that took real training to hold on to when a screaming wave of men was 50 yards away and closing. That restraint, firing less, but firing exactly when and where it counted, was harder to teach than marksmanship, and it is the reason the doctrine took most of a year of hard combat to fully mature. Training this into a squad meant rebuilding habits that had nothing to do with marksmanship. Riflemen had to learn to think of themselves as protecting and resupplying one man, rather than simply advancing on their own initiative. The automatic rifleman himself had to learn the discipline of not firing at all until a target was worth the burst, because a magazine spent too early was a magazine not available when a charge actually reached its final rush. Drill instructors and combat-experienced sergeants passed this down unit by unit, often correcting it under fire rather than on a training range, which is part of why the doctrine took the better part of a year of hard fighting to mature into something reliable across the whole Pacific theater, rather than something only a few well-led units executed well. The underlying logic, stripped down to something a person could repeat to a friend afterward, was this: don't try to out-endure a determined enemy with individual courage alone. Build one weapon system into the smallest possible unit that can generate more sustained fire than that unit could ever produce with rifles alone, and let that be the wall the enemy has to walk into. The structural trap this set for the Japanese army was almost total, and it came from the same qualities that had made their infantry so effective for the war's first 2 years. Standard Japanese issue was the bolt-action Arisaka rifle, a fine weapon for marksmanship, but no faster to reload than the American M1903 that had already proven inadequate to the task on Bataan. Japanese squads did carry a light machine gun, the Type 11 and later the Type 96 and Type 99, but these were designed around a different tactical philosophy: sustained defensive fire from a fixed or semi-fixed position, fed by awkward hopper or strip-fed magazines that were slower to reload than a simple box, and prone to stoppages when fouled with dirt or moisture, a chronic weakness in humid island conditions. Critically, the entire Japanese small unit system was built to support the rifleman and bayonet assault, not to answer one. Doctrine, training pipelines, and officer culture all reinforced the night charge as the decisive tactic. Questioning it, or arguing for a shift toward defensive firepower and dug-in positions, was institutionally difficult in an army whose command culture prized offensive spirit as a moral virtue almost as much as a tactical one. High command misread the growing evidence for years, treating early defeats as failures of individual courage or of specific commanders, rather than as a systemic mismatch against a squad that could now produce automatic fire on its own. Officers who survived repeated failed assaults and argued for a change in tactics risked being seen, inside a culture that equated offensive spirit with honor itself, as questioning the fighting quality of their own men rather than the arithmetic of the battlefield. That made the institutional correction slower than the battlefield evidence alone would have required, and it is a pattern that shows up again and again in military history on every side of every war. The hardest doctrine to abandon is the one that used to work. And underneath the doctrinal argument sat an arithmetic problem that never went away. The men Japan lost in these repeated attacks were, disproportionately, its most experienced infantry soldiers who had trained for years and fought across multiple campaigns, while the American replacements filling out squads across the Pacific arrived from an industrial training pipeline that could produce riflemen and bar gunners by the tens of thousands. One side was spending an irreplaceable asset. The other was spending a renewable one. Wilson Watson did not come from a military family or a background that suggested any of this. He was born in Tuscumbia, Alabama, in February 1922, one of 7 children raised by sharecroppers, and he had a total of about 5 years of formal schooling before the demands of farm labor took over the rest of his childhood. By 1940, the family was sharecropping in Crittenden County, Arkansas, working land that belonged to someone else for a share of what it produced, a life that offered almost no path off the farm, except the one that found nearly every young man of his generation. He registered for the draft in the summer of 1942 and enlisted in the Marine Corps that August, and within 2 years he had already seen combat at Bougainville and Guam as a Browning automatic rifleman with Company G, 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, 3rd Marine Division, a private with a reputation among the men around him for a kind of flat, unhesitating aggression that officers noticed and quietly relied on. There is one detail about him that has nothing to do with any of that. Men who served alongside him remembered a soldier who, off the line, was almost shy, a quiet farm kid who rarely spoke first in a conversation. It did not match what they watched him do with a bar in his hands. Bougainville, where his division fought through the last months of 1943 and into 1944, was a campaign fought largely in dense rainforest against a Japanese garrison that had not yet abandoned the doctrine of the night counterattack. And it was there, in mud and standing water, that a 19- and 20-year-old Watson first learned the rhythm this story has already described. Keep the weapon clean. Keep the burst short. Trust the men around you to keep you fed with magazines. Guam followed in the summer of 1944, a harder fight than its short duration on paper suggests, fought over volcanic ridgelines not unlike the ones he would climb the following February. By the time the 3rd Marine Division landed in the third wave on Iwo Jima, Watson was 22 years old and already a veteran of 2 campaigns, carrying a weapon he had used enough times to trust completely, and carrying also the kind of quiet, hard-earned competence that no amount of stateside training alone could produce. The proof that this doctrine actually worked did not arrive in a single battle. It accumulated, engagement after engagement, across 2.5 years of island fighting, but the shape of it is visible clearly in what Watson's platoon experienced in the days after that first pillbox assault on February 26. Iwo Jima was, by that point in the war, defended by a Japanese garrison that had already learned, the hard way, on other islands, that the old doctrine of a massed open charge into American positions had stopped working. Its commander, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, had ordered something almost unheard of in Japanese military culture. No banzai charges, dig in, force the Americans to come to every fortified position and pay for it 1 yard at a time. That decision was itself an admission, arrived at through bitter experience elsewhere in the Pacific, that a coordinated night charge into squads built around automatic weapons had become a way to lose men for nothing. So the fighting Watson's platoon faced on Iwo Jima was not the old open-ground assault. It was a network of pillboxes, caves, and interlocking fields of fire dug into volcanic rock, each one requiring exactly the kind of close-range automatic fire and grenade work that Watson had just demonstrated. 12 Marines and 5 Navy corpsmen would eventually receive the Medal of Honor for actions on Iwo Jima alone, more than in any other single campaign in American military history to that point, and a striking number of those citations describe the same basic sequence: a squad pinned down by interlocking fire, and one man, usually an automatic rifleman, closing the distance alone to break it open. Before the second day of Watson's fight is told, it is worth pausing on how carefully this record has to be checked, because a channel that gets facts like this wrong has no business telling stories like this. Every figure in this account, the 20-round magazine, the 16-pound weight of the weapon, the dates on Iwo Jima, the units involved, comes from official Medal of Honor citations, Marine Corps unit histories, and contemporaneous ordnance records, cross-checked against each other rather than pulled from a single source. If you have seen a version of this story online with a different casualty count or a different date, it is worth checking where that number actually comes from, because Pacific War numbers get inflated and simplified more than almost any other body of World War II history. If that kind of verification is worth something to you, it is worth a moment of your time to follow this channel, because it is the standard the rest of this story is held to. Turn now to the other side of that ridge, because what the Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima were experiencing by this stage of the war deserves its own accounting rather than a footnote. Garrison troops facing the American advance across the Pacific by 1944 and 1945 had, by their own after-action reports and the accounts of the rare prisoners taken, developed a specific and lasting fear of the American automatic rifleman. Not the tank, not naval gunfire, which they understood and could dig deep enough to survive. But the single soldier who could appear at the mouth of a bunker and put 20 rounds through the embrasure before a defender could bring his own weapon to bear. Japanese infantry manuals and unit instructions from the later Pacific campaigns show a marked shift toward warning troops to identify and prioritize killing automatic riflemen specifically, recognizing that a squad that lost its bar gunner lost most of its offensive punch. That is a remarkable inversion for an army that 4 years earlier had specialized in convincing entire garrisons to surrender through the sheer psychological weight of its night attacks. By 1945, the fear had changed hands. The scoreboard, across the wider Pacific campaign, climbed accordingly, and other men besides Watson carried it. On Okinawa, in April 1945, an Army private first class named Alejandro Ruiz found his own squad ambushed in a ravine near a village called Gasukuma, every man beside him except his squad leader dead or wounded within moments, pinned by fire from a camouflaged pillbox his standard 8-round M1 rifle could not answer. He picked up a Browning automatic rifle from a fallen comrade, walked 35 yards into open fire toward the position, climbed on top of it, and when the weapon jammed on a ruptured cartridge, beat back a charging defender with the broken gun itself, then ran back through the same gauntlet of fire to retrieve a second bar and finish the job. 12 Japanese soldiers killed, the position destroyed, his platoon saved. It was the same doctrine, the same weapon, an ocean current of small unit tactics that had by then become standard practice across every American division in the theater, and it is worth noting what that scale meant strategically. This was no longer a story about one talented individual. Entire regiments were now built to generate this kind of firepower as a matter of course, and that reliability, not any single hero's skill, is what let American commanders plan assaults on fortified islands with a confidence that would have been reckless in 1942. That shift in institutional confidence is what made possible the single operation this story has been building toward the entire time, and it happened on a ridge on Iwo Jima over roughly 15 minutes that Wilson Watson would carry in his body for the rest of his life. It started the day after the pillbox. Watson's platoon, still pushing forward through the same broken volcanic terrain, was stopped again, this time at the base of a small hill defended by mortar and machine gun positions dug into the crest, exactly the kind of interlocking defensive network Kurabayashi's doctrine had built the entire island's defense around. The argument in the moments before the assault was the same one that had been playing out across the Pacific for 2 years in one form or another. Go around, wait for artillery to soften it, or accept the cost of going straight up the slope while the position was still hot. Watson, along with his assistant bar man, chose to go straight up. What made the position genuinely difficult was not just the machine guns. It was the knee mortars, small, portable grenade launchers Japanese infantry used with real skill at close range, capable of dropping rounds almost vertically into a trench or a hilltop position from just beyond grenade-throwing distance, a weapon many American troops badly underestimated until they had been on the receiving end of it. Watson scaled the incline under that combined fire, firing his bar from the hip as he climbed, and reached the crest of the hill with his assistant gunner still beside him. What happened next is documented almost minute by minute in his Medal of Honor citation, corroborated by the men who reached the position afterward. Watson held the crest of that hill alone against a Japanese counterattack for close to 15 minutes, standing exposed at the top under mortar fire and grenades, firing from the hip until he ran out of ammunition. By the time his platoon caught up to him and the position was secured, 60 Japanese soldiers were dead on that hilltop, killed in a defensive stand by essentially one man and the weapon he refused to put down. He had been hit 7 times by rifle fire and struck by mortar fragments in the shoulder during those 15 minutes, and he stayed on the crest anyway until the position held. There is a credit dispute worth being honest about here, the kind this format insists on rather than smooths over. Watson did not do it entirely alone, and his own account never claimed otherwise. His assistant barman climbed the same incline under the same fire, and stayed beside him through most of the engagement, feeding magazines and firing his own weapon until the ammunition ran out for both of them. The platoon that reached the crest minutes later finished securing a position Watson had made possible to hold, not one he had cleared single-handedly in the way later retellings sometimes suggest. The citation itself is precise about this, crediting him with the initiative and the sustained stand at the crest, while the historical record around it makes clear that no 15 minutes on that hill happened in true isolation. The moral effect of those 15 minutes went well beyond the 60 men it cost the Japanese defense. It told every Marine on that ridge, and every Japanese soldier watching from the next position over, exactly what the doctrine built around one man and one automatic weapon was now capable of when it was pushed to its absolute limit. Not a tactic anymore, but a demonstrated fact about what could not be stopped by numbers alone. The Japanese defense of Iwo Jima did not recover from losses like that, because there was no time and no mechanism left to recover from them. Garrison reports and later interrogations of the handful of survivors described a steady psychological deterioration among the defenders as the campaign wore on into March. A recognition, expressed in surviving diaries and letters recovered from the battlefield, that the old advantages no longer applied, that American squads simply generated more sustained close-range fire than a static defense, however well dug in, could indefinitely absorb. The Japanese Army did attempt to build its own answer during the war's final years, experimenting with improved light machine guns and issuing more automatic weapons down to the squad level. But every attempt arrived too late, in numbers far too small, and without the training pipeline or industrial base to make the shift systemic rather than sporadic. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese troops who defended Iwo Jima, only 216 were still alive when the island was declared secure, a number that reflects not just the ferocity of the fighting, but the almost total absence, by that stage, of any doctrine that let a Japanese defensive position survive sustained American automatic fire at close range. Watson did not walk away from Iwo Jima either, though he lived. He continued fighting after the hilltop stand, staying on the line through the following days despite his wounds, until March 2, when he was hit by a gunshot to the neck and finally evacuated from the island. He recovered, was presented the Medal of Honor by President Harry Truman at the White House on October 5, 1945, alongside 13 other men from the same brutal campaign, and then did something almost nobody expects from a man who has just been given his country's highest award for valor. He went home to Arkansas for a while, and then re-enlisted, first in the Army Air Force and later in the Army itself, eventually serving as an enlisted cook and reaching the rank of staff sergeant before retiring from military service in 1966. He married a woman named Patricia, had 2 children, and spent his later military years working, of all things, as a mess hall cook. A small, almost deliberately unglamorous irony for a man once called a one-man regiment, and one that says something about how little he seemed to trade on the medal itself. He died in Russellville, Arkansas, in December 1994, 72 years old, a private citizen for most of his life after the 15 minutes that made him briefly famous, remembered locally more than nationally, in the way that seems to be true of a great many of the men who earned this country's highest award for valor, and then simply went home. The men on his own hilltop had a nickname for him before the citation ever used the words Medal of Honor, the one-man regiment of Iwo Jima, and it followed him quietly for the rest of his life, mentioned in local newspapers more than in any national retelling. Alejandro Ruiz, the second man this story has followed, came through his own assault at Gasukuma without a serious wound, received his Medal of Honor from Truman the following June, stayed in the Army through the Korean War, retired as a master sergeant in the mid-1960s, and died of congestive heart failure in California in 2009 at 86. A long life that stands, deliberately, as a kind of counterpoint to how close both men came to not having one at all. Behind every name this story has used sits a much larger, mostly unfamous system that made the whole doctrine possible. For every Watson or Ruiz whose actions were extraordinary enough to be written up and cited, there were tens of thousands of ordinary automatic riflemen across the Pacific whose names never reached a newspaper. Men who carried a 16-pound weapon through jungle heat and volcanic ash, kept it clean enough to fire when it mattered, and simply did the job the doctrine asked of them without a single moment dramatic enough for a citation. Behind them sat an industrial and training system capable of producing enough bars, enough trained gunners, and enough replacement magazines to keep that doctrine running at full strength across every division in every campaign simultaneously. The unglamorous machinery of ammunition depots, ordnance repair units, and stateside training battalions that made it possible for a 19-year-old with a few weeks of instruction to become, functionally, the most dangerous man in his squad. There was a cost carried disproportionately by the men who filled that role, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than glossed over. A bar gunner drew enemy fire the instant he was identified, because every soldier on the other side understood exactly what that weapon meant to a squad's fighting power, and casualty rates among automatic riflemen across the Pacific ran well above the rate for ordinary infantrymen carrying a standard rifle. Being the center of the doctrine that was winning the war was not, for the men who carried it, a position of safety. It was closer to the opposite. Laid out plainly and in order, the turning points of this story run as follows. 1917, John Browning designs the bar to answer a specific tactical problem in trench warfare that the war ends before fully testing. 1937, the Army modifies it into the M1918A2, adding a bipod for prone fire. 1941 and 42, early Pacific defeats at Malaya, Bataan, and Corregidor expose the mismatch between Japanese night assault doctrine and American bolt-action infantry firepower. 1942 into 43. Guadalcanal becomes the proving ground where squad-centered automatic fire tactics begin to mature under sustained combat pressure. 1944. Japanese command begins quietly abandoning the open banzai charge in favor of dug-in defense, an implicit admission that the old doctrine no longer worked. February 1945. Wilson Watson's actions on Iwo Jima demonstrate the doctrine at its most extreme individual expression. April 1945. Alejandro Ruiz repeats the pattern on Okinawa, showing it had become standard practice across the theater rather than a single unit's innovation. Strip away the individual stories, and four structural factors explain the reversal this whole account has been describing. First, the machine itself. A genuinely portable automatic weapon that a single infantryman could carry, fire from multiple positions, and keep running even when fouled with mud and volcanic ash, giving the individual rifleman a category of firepower he had never had in any previous American war. Second, the doctrine, organizing the smallest possible combat unit, the 12-man squad, entirely around that one weapon, so that firepower no longer scaled only with the number of riflemen present, but with the discipline of a single automatic gunner and the men protecting him. Third, the concentration this made possible, the ability to mass genuinely overwhelming sustained fire at the exact point of an enemy assault, without needing to bring up a crew-served weapon or wait for supporting units to reposition. Fourth, the system standing behind all of it, an American industrial and training base that could arm, train, and replace automatic riflemen on a scale the Japanese training and production system, straining under years of attrition and a shrinking pool of veteran infantry, simply could not match. The attrition arithmetic by the war's end was stark on both fronts. Watson and Ruiz fought. Of the roughly 21,000 troops defending Iwo Jima, only 216 survived. Of the 70,000 Marines who fought there, close to 7,000 were killed and another 20,000 wounded. A battle that, even with every advantage the bar-centered squad doctrine provided, remained the costliest in Marine Corps history, a fact worth holding onto rather than smoothing over. The honest version of this story requires a footnote the popular retelling usually skips. The Browning automatic rifle did not win the Pacific War, and no single weapon did. Naval gunfire, carrier aviation, mortars, flamethrowers, and above all the individual courage and endurance of ordinary infantrymen carrying ordinary rifles, did as much of the actual killing and dying across these campaigns as any one automatic weapon. And crediting the bar alone flattens a much larger, more collaborative reality of combined arms warfare that historians who study these campaigns closely are careful never to oversimplify. What genuinely holds up under scrutiny is narrower and, in some ways, more interesting than the legend. That a specific doctrinal choice, building the infantry squad around one automatic rifleman rather than treating automatic fire as a specialized, separate asset, measurably changed what a Japanese night assault or a fortified defensive position could survive, and that this shift shows up consistently, campaign after campaign, in the citations, unit histories, and Japanese after-action reports on both sides of the fighting. The part of the legend that does not survive close reading is the idea of the bar as some singular miracle weapon. The part that does survive is the doctrine built around it, which turned out to matter more than the hardware itself. That doctrine outlived the weapon by decades. The bar itself was retired from frontline American service after the Korean War, replaced eventually by lighter, faster-cycling squad automatic weapons that borrowed its central premise almost unchanged. One automatic weapon, built into the smallest infantry unit, as the base of fire everything else in that unit's tactics depends on. That premise remains the foundation of infantry squad organization in the United States military today, run through generations of successor weapons that Browning himself, who died in 1926 at his workbench in Belgium, working on a design for another company entirely, never lived to see proven in the war his weapon was actually built for. On Iwo Jima itself, a black volcanic beach that still yields rusted fragments of both armies' equipment to visitors and researchers decades later, the graves and the names have long since been moved home or consolidated into memorial cemeteries, but veterans of both sides who spoke about the battle in the decades afterward described it, almost without exception, in the same restrained terms, not glory, but respect for what the other side had endured. American veterans of the campaign, interviewed years and even decades later, rarely reached for triumphant language when asked about it. More often they described a kind of grim disbelief that anyone had walked off that island at all, on either side. Japanese survivors, the tiny handful who lived to be interviewed, spoke similarly about the Americans they had fought, not as an enemy without honor, but as an opponent whose firepower and organization had simply outmatched a defense fought with everything the defenders had left to give. That mutual, unsentimental respect between men who had tried to kill each other is one of the more consistent threads running through Pacific War oral history, and it sits uneasily but honestly alongside everything else this account has described. The doctrine that survived is easy to summarize in a single sentence. The kind Watson himself, a quiet man for most of his life outside of those 15 minutes on a ridge, would probably have found more useful than any medal. A defense built around one disciplined automatic weapon in the hands of one determined man could hold ground that raw numbers, however brave, could not take. If a story like this one is the kind of history you want more of, checked carefully, told at the level of the individual soldier rather than the sweeping statistic, subscribing costs nothing, and puts the next one in front of you automatically. And there is a specific reason to stick around for what this channel covers next. The doctrine this video has just walked through, one weapon built into the center of a squad, became the direct ancestor of how every modern army organizes its infantry. And the story of how that idea got tested, refined, and nearly abandoned in the years after this war is one very few channels have told accurately. If anything in Wilson Watson's 15 minutes on that ridge surprised you, say so, specifically, in the comments, what part of it you didn't expect, because that is genuinely the best way to help find the next story worth telling this carefully.